Welcome back to the second part of the day, and thank you to the excellent panels and for the discussion this morning, for the moderators and the speakers, for presenting some extremely polished research that was sponsored by Microsoft and Berkeley Center for Law and Technology. And for this afternoon session, we enter perhaps a more speculative or aspirational part of the discussion, and it's devoted to the question of extending the open data imperative to the private commercial sector, who by dint of legislation, intentional or opportunistic information gathering practices have amassed enormous repositories of information and data, and perhaps focusing on the amassing of this information that is about people. When we think about some of the concerns and what is gathered under the concerns that make us think about responsible use of open data. In many instances, these data repositories surpass the amount, extent, and scope of information collected by public institutions, if only, for one, that these are global in scope and often less constrained in their actions by law. Though one of the prominent open data arguments aimed at government is, and we heard this last night, is that we have a right to data as tax-paying owners of the data, and obviously that does not apply to the private sector. I would argue that many of the aspirational arguments for open data and access to open data, which our keynote speakers, for example, discussed last night, do apply to the public sector. So I'm quoting, I took this quote from Mashariki's presentation, the city's open data laws declaration. Open data serves to streamline government operation, but in addition allows the public to assist in identifying efficient solutions, create economic opportunities, promote innovative strategies for social progress. Of course, there are many reasons for the open data imperative, and going by some of Chris's insights, these have been present for us over the course of quite a number of years, and you may not agree with all of them, because some of them are, for example, that people don't trust government. Perhaps you think that government is not asking the right questions, or perhaps you think government is asking the right questions but coming to the wrong conclusions. Perhaps you want insight into government functioning as a way to maintain, as we heard with the court records, maintain transparency and accountability, sometimes prevent corruption, and so on. Perhaps you want to use the data to conduct research, promote knowledge, serve broad societal goals in ways that champions of data science have asserted over and over again at the moment. So this afternoon, we ask these questions. Can we replace government in all of these statements with some of the major data holders in the private sector? Can we, in other words, extend the responsible open data imperative to private commercial entities? Consider the potential windfall for everyone, potential dangers and pitfalls. If yes, how can this be done and under what conditions? What technologies and policies would be necessary in order to extract broader societal benefits from access to data held in private hands? So our panels include experts who've already started asking these questions and have made a lot of progress. We're grateful to academics, advocates, and companies for joining us in this discussion, and in particular companies who understand the potential to make significant contributions to the public good and are taking steps and are proving exemplary in this regard. Also contributing to these panels are those whose groundbreaking work provides insights into the whys, the hows, and the whats. We look forward to the conversation today, and with anticipation of its continuing forward into the future. So I'm now happy to hand the floor over to Yafit, who's going to moderate this panel.
Thank you, Helen. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Yafit. I'm an ILI fellow, the Information Law Institute fellow, and I'm very happy to be moderating this panel. So you heard a lot about moderator privilege before, but to the extent it pertains to asking the first question. So I had the moderator privilege of getting a partial shot of what those very interesting speakers are going to talk about, and you all want to listen. So we have Cathy O'Neill, Steve Farber, and Elaine Sedenberg. I hope I didn't butcher your names. And I think we're going to start with Cathy.
Yeah, I just want to. Hi, everyone. I have a Prezi here. I'm very happy to be here. I'm a data scientist and a mathematician. I come at this from thinking about the way data models are actually done in private companies. I worked both in finance at a hedge fund called D.E. Shaw, as well as a risk firm called Riskmetrics, and then later on as a data scientist at an ad tech company. So I have kind of a view on exactly how the mindset lives in private sectors, and I think it's pretty alarming. You can read my bio there, but one thing it doesn't mention is that I'm actually writing a book called Weapons of Math Destruction: How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy. So I really have been focusing on my research for the book on sort of the things that can go wrong. I'm not saying that everything is bad. I'll try to be positive by the end, but that's not my style, actually, so watch out. I have 3 critiques, essentially, of the open data movement, and I have 1 proposal, which hopefully will lead us to what Helen was discussing, ways forward. And by the way, I'm glad she said speculative. I appreciated that. So the thing about it, the number 1 thing about open data for me is that it's already too downstream. Like, open data refers to data that already exists. And even when it's open, it's not entirely open. So we could talk a lot about which data is not collected. And I would argue that the kind of data we actually want the New York City to open up would be possibly include actual living conditions at Rikers, more than we see it now. We also see that you have private companies like Axiom and Lending Club offer some of their data, but not all of it. And so it's like, is that open or not? I don't think that's really open. Especially if you know what a Lending Club is, it's a peer-to-peer lender which gives basically credit scores to people based on all sorts of things that you traditionally think of credit scores as using, like FICO scores are one of the inputs to their algorithm, but they also, at least when they launched, were in partnership with Facebook, use social network data. So it's a peer-to-peer lending, which means they assign an interest rate to someone who wants to borrow money, and then people who want to lend money can then go and look at all the people who want to borrow money and look at those scores. They're also allowed to get some of the data on those people, but they're not allowed to see, for example, the social network data. So that's the kind of thing I mean. It's like somewhat open, but not actually entirely open. And I know that I missed the second panel because I was recording a Slate podcast in the West Village, but I know that you guys talked about things you can infer and the way that models use that. So from social network data, if you combine that with the concept of a credit score, you can well imagine that there could be disparate impact issues coming in there, but we don't get to see that. And Axiom, similarly, is the data warehousing company that has opened up some of its data, but it, for example, shows you what it thinks your gender is and your birth date is, but it doesn't, for example, tell you whether you're on a list of people who might have a disease at your house, like represent some kind of like diabetes or something like that. So they get to choose what to show you. That's not really open data. Not to say that we think that we're done with private, like company open data. I'm just making the point that we have a long struggle ahead of us. I also want to just question what data really is. Like, what kind of data do we collect? And it's a power thing, right? Like, we collect data about prisoners, but not about prisons. We collect data about arrest records, but not necessarily specifically about the police that interact with those people. Like, I helped in the very first DataKind hackathon, I helped open up with the NYCLU the stop and frisk data. And one of the first things we noticed is that it was anonymized, but it was like not symmetrically anonymized. So like, it was anonymized both for the people who were being stopped and frisked and for the police. But there was actually no information about the police at all. You couldn't even figure out whether this person did 3 stop and frisks, like even a anonymized medallion. There was no medallion, if you see what I mean. Whereas with the people who were stopped, that was also anonymized, but my friend Luis Daniel figured out who the most often stopped and frisked person was based on the data in that set. He actually found that person in the Harlem. Got it. So what we see is borrowers, people take data, we collect data about borrowers but not lenders. There's an enormous amount of surveillance for employees but not for employers. And what it comes down to is that we have defined success. The people who own the data, the people who are collecting data about people, are defining the success. That means that the data collection itself, which is upstream from opening it, is absolutely skewed in favor of the powerful. And of course, it's used by those people who collect the data. It's used to sentence people. It's used to filter people out from jobs that they're seeking. It's used to squeeze employees for more productivity, and it's used to assess performance. One of the examples I have in my book is for value-added model for teachers that's being widely used in the nation, 40 states actually, but specifically in New York City. There was a Freedom of Information Act request by the New York Post to publicly list all the teachers in New York City and their scores. So that was open, if you think about Freedom of Information Act creating an open data set. But I then filed a Freedom of Information Act to get the source code, and that was not available. In particular, the third-party company, private company, that did the analysis had a licensing agreement with the city that they didn't have to explain anything to the city. So not only did the teachers not understand how they were being assessed, but none of the people in New York City at the Department of Education understood that either. So I would question what kind of, how far we have to go for transparency in that sense. So here's my proposal, and I only have 3 minutes left, and I'm going to end on time. I think private companies should be forced to open their data in certain cases. And my scenario for that is when they have an extreme amount of impact and in a widespread way on civil servants or just individuals who come to their websites looking for to borrow money or things like that, or whether they're looking for a job. When there's an important sort of life moment, life decision, and it's a widespread algorithm that's being used to make that decision for them, that's when somebody should be able to understand what the data is. Just as, and by the way, what's great about this is we have precedent. I'm not a lawyer, you guys are, but we have precedent with FICRA. I think FICRA is the one that lets you see what you see your credit report. You get to see what the data comes in. We also have ways, we also should demand transparent and open data in certain ways to be able to audit the process that is making these decisions. And we have a precedent for that, which is the law that says that banks who give mortgages have to show who applied and who actually got the mortgages. This was in response to redlining. So there's all sorts of precedent which I feel like needs to be updated and modernized for the big data movement, for the big data world, because we have algorithms all around us who are shaping our lives. And they're creating feedback loops, which I don't have time to talk about. But we need to examine those, and the way we examine that is we have transparency for those cases in that situation. I'm not saying that a given private company couldn't decide which website to show a given person when they come based on whether they've logged in recently. That's something that probably nobody cares about. But if it means that they're going to get a job offer or not get a job offer, that's when it kicks in, that you need that you need transparency. And at the end of the day, I have, as a data scientist, all sorts of plans on how to, if that data is open, how to investigate these processes and audit them for fairness from the perspective of the public, which I can't do now. So when people ask me, what do I want to work on, or what am I working on, I always have to say, well, I'm not working on what I want to be working on because the data isn't available to me. Thanks.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Steve Farber. Thanks very much for inviting me to talk to you today. What I want to do today is give you a research imperative for the use of private data, corporately owned data, in order to promote the asking and maybe the answering of new questions in urban social sciences. I only have 10 minutes, so now let me narrow that greatly. I'm a transportation geographer, so my particular research interests are in the areas of travel behavior modeling and understanding the social implications of people's daily behaviors. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background of that research area, the data that we use in that research area, then the need for the use of big data or privately held data to kind of advance the types of questions that we're able to ask. And then maybe talk about some possibilities for doing that in a ethical, safe, respectful way. Okay, really quick background, all right? Travel behavior research really started with an investigation of why streets had traffic on them. That evolved into an understanding that people are making trips, and that's why there's traffic, so we have to understand where trips are coming from and where they're going to. And in the 70s, we figured out that there's actually people in cars making those trips, okay? And it was important to understand people, not the cars. So in order to understand people, travel behavior researchers, who by and large are civil engineers, started collecting data on people's activity patterns. So where they conduct the timing and locations of people's everyday activities, as well as their context, their social context, their environmental context, and so on. So the travel engineer or the transportation engineer takes that data and models and understanding of human behavior in order to fix a traffic problem. And what's kind of emerged over the last 20 years, 15 years, people like me who are taking that expertise and data and models in order to imbue or to ask what these daily behaviors can tell us about social science. So what's the relationship between people's activity patterns and their life outcomes, their quality of life, and how that aggregates up to different aspects of society, equity in society, and so on. So I'll give you some examples of that. It's a little bit vague. So the big picture then is that we're starting with a picture of the city, the spatial structure of a region. We know that governs people's daily activity behaviors. Those activity behaviors cause social, environmental, and economic outcomes in a region. And then as researchers, we're interested in understanding those links so that we can design better policies that impact the spatial structure of a region, so transportation and land use policies, in order to mitigate or enhance the conditions of a region. So mitigate the negative aspects of activity behavior or enhance them, the positive aspects. So in order to do this, we are extremely data hungry, all right? We need data on the social and environmental contexts of people's daily behaviors. We need psychological data psychometrics that tell us about people's planning of activities and their motivations for conducting activities. We need data on households, how many workers are in households, how many children, who's going to school, do they ride their bikes to school, or do they have cars and their parents drive them to school, do they have transit passes? So really understanding the household level demands and opportunities as well, mobility tools. And then on top of all of that, we need really detailed information on the actual activity patterns of people. So the locations where they're conducting their activities, the timing, their mode of transportation, the social context, who they're doing those activities with. We need all of this data. So typically that data is collected purposefully in something called a travel survey. Our state governments, our cities, there's some efforts at the national level, collect this data. It's not big data. It's not, being volunteered in real time from the population. These are purposefully collected surveys. But actually, I would argue that this data is quite open, especially to the research community. But once the data is collected, for good or for bad, it's actually quite readily available, more so in the United States probably than anywhere else. All right, so actually you guys would cringe if you knew what kind of data I just get handed by transportation planning authorities, data that shows me the lat long of every survey respondent's home address, in addition to all of the places where they went over the course of a day, okay? And they don't know that I have access to this data. So no requirement for me to do a research, to put my proposal in front of a research ethics board. Nothing. So very sensitive data. Anyways, but these are all purposely collected, extremely expensive. So most of the emphasis then on the transition to open data or big data has been cost savings. So essentially trying to use new sources of data so that we can replace or augment our really expensive travel surveys. And mobile phone data has been kind of harped on a lot as a source of ubiquitous, continuous, and cheap measures of human activity patterns. And it's true. So on the left-hand side, this is an Italian data set. They're looking at trajectories of mobile phones in order to understand the relationships between urban systems. That's Pisa and Siena. On the right-hand side, we've got a mobile phone data set countrywide in Estonia, and they're using the patterns of the mobile phones to look at economic structure and labor markets of the country. Now, these are things, and these are questions that we've been asking and answering already for decades, all right, just using conventional data sources. And that's fine, we can do it cheaper, but it doesn't really expand what we can know about society, right? It just allows us to look at the same questions more frequently. Anyways, so I think the thing holding us back is that this mobile phone data it's really void of semantics. It just gives us the geometry, the geography of where people are going, but we don't know anything about those people themselves. So my argument is that in order to push the research agenda, we have to be doing this messy thing. We have to be using linked data, all right? So we have to find a way to link these sources of trajectories with other sources of information that are kind of sitting in data sets all over the world. So I'm looking at, I'm not actually looking at this, but I'm talking about connecting the trajectory data with data on social media. So what do people say about themselves and what can we infer about people? And that can help us replace the need to do really detailed demographic surveys in conjunction with our travel behavior surveys, all right? So we can take the cell phones, link them to social media, and have a profile about the individuals that we're actually able to look at spatially. I've listed some other sources there, credit cards and loyalty cards to look at consumption behavior. But the idea here is to ask brand new questions that we haven't been able to ask before. What is the role, generally speaking, of travel behavior, mobility in the formation of society, very broadly? So how is social capital influenced by mobility and social contact? How do people create meaningful connections inside their communities in an age of hypermobility? What is the experience of segregation, not based on residential segregation, but based on the patterns of people's daily lives and what neighborhoods they're conducting their daily activities in over the course of a day, on weekends, in their leisure time, and how does that change over time? Really kind of new questions that we haven't been able to ask before. So I think that's the imperative in order to figure out how we're going to do this data linking and analysis in a safe way. So just some examples of basic analyses that we can do with some linked data. So on the left-hand side, this is that Estonia data again. They've got a data set, 50% of the country's cell phones, all of the trajectory information. The only variable they know about the cell phone holders is whether or not they opted to speak Russian or Estonian when they contacted the phone company. It just so happens that in Estonia, that's one of the major social divides that exists in their society. So the research allowed them to look at these spatial patterns of segregation over the course, comparing homes to workplaces, comparing workplaces to leisure time, comparing evenings to weekends, and then looking at this data over a 3-year period to look at trends so things that are unimaginable using conventional data sets. On the right-hand side, we've got consumption data from a Spanish credit card company who looked at the distances from home that transactions took place at for different types of people and different types of transactions. So all of a sudden, for the first time, we can look at the role of, say, urban form on spatial behavior in a massive way. So looking at whether or not building, well, there's a concept called new urbanism that kind of promotes traditional style neighborhoods. We don't know what impact that really has on people's daily behavior, so that we can answer kind of fundamental urban planning questions using these types of data sets as well. So I have to stop. I will do this very quickly. 30 seconds. 30 seconds? Okay. So just putting it out here that we have good models of safe environments for data analysis coming from statistics or Census Bureau research data centers, CDC data centers. The data are there. It's highly sensitive. In order to access, you have to be somehow accredited. You have to give a research proposal. And importantly, to get out, you need to be vetted for that you're not risking identification, right, of the respondents. So a model like that could work. And I'll just leave you with 2 questions, big questions that I think you're all already dealing with much more than me. But, budgets for collecting data, government data, is actually on the decline. So replacing census with voluntary surveys, that's happening all over the world today. And a lot of it is being done and supported by the fact that there's all this new data that's just out there that cities and researchers are going to be able to use, and therefore we don't need the census anymore, right? And I mean, clearly that may or may not be true, but the big question to us is, if it is true, how are we going to make things work so researchers can actually get a hold of this data? So right now there's huge inequalities, and even within the research community, on who has access to sources of big data and who doesn't. And I think that's a big issue. So the slides there, let me respect the time, and thank you very much for listening.
There we go. All right, thank you. So I couldn't have asked for a better cue up for my presentation here. I'm Elaine. I work with Deirdre Mulligan at the UC Berkeley School of Information. Today I'm going to talk briefly about cybersecurity and what role open data may play as we come to terms with how we're going to share information in this sector. And to do so, we looked at the public health model, specifically the CDC, and how they mitigate access and how their policies and practices are designed, and what kind of takeaways we could apply to the private sector and data that might be useful there. So cybersecurity is a national priority. Our growing dependence upon internet-connected things, devices that are connected to each other, just further underscore how important this is as both a national and international priority. We're not starting with a clean slate here. This is already, the horse has left the barn in terms of people are people are self-forming, information sharing is already happening in certain sectors, and Congress has taken a keen interest in this, and a month ago, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act passed the Senate and is now going on to the House. So there are active proposals. Notably, things that are missing from the current proposal is a lack of specificity in terms of how we're going to facilitate sharing of this information and data that's associated with that. Also, how are we going to protect privacy, and what specifically are our privacy concerns with these data? We're aware that they're there, but there is not very much specificity within these proposals. So when we talk about cybersecurity data, we're not talking about just one thing. It's not data as a product. It's not like we're talking about a wearable company that's collecting data about users. We're talking about many different things. So we're talking about vulnerabilities within code or hardware, things that might be proprietary or have economic interest to a particular company. We're talking about best practices, both on the user side and on the corporate side. We may be talking about user activity when they're using the internet on their ISP or on a particular platform, a social media platform or something else, the way spam proliferates. And we're also talking about incidents on individual networks. So you as a corporation, even removed from your users or your product, intrusions that might happen on your networks. And even remediation attempts. What have you tried? What worked? What failed? So this is a wide range of things that we're talking about here. It's not a one-size-fits-all. But these leave some key questions as we're considering this. And also, a lot of these data are held by the private sector. We need to consider what are the goals information sharing is seeking to achieve. Again, these proposals are they're saying there's an intention that information sharing and data associated with that may give us a clue and help us understand the problem space, but there isn't much specificity for what we are trying to achieve with those data. Information sharing is a means, not an end. There's open questions for how are we going to balance the values and consider other trade-offs. So the trade-off between privacy and security is one value that we might need to consider, but there are other trade-offs that we need to decide how we're going to evaluate those and who's going to be a part of that discussion. And finally, what role may open data play in this sector? It doesn't all need to be offline and dark. It should be something that we might be able to find these aspects that many different stakeholders can take part in, not just corporations and the government. So to do this, we looked at public health, which is an old field, has a rich information environment. There are public good qualities both to public health and security. So they face chronic underinvestment by the private sector. They require a holistic approach to looking at the problem. And with public health, the information environment is essential to fueling research activities. So we think about there's a lot of different stakeholders, whether you're a community leader and you want to know what's happening with the medical conditions and environmental conditions in your particular community so that you can advocate for change, or it might be researchers who are trying to notice a new trend that we haven't previously seen in society. There's also inherent data sensitivity. So when we're talking about public health data, we're talking about whether you got the flu or whether you got HIV and how many sexual partners you had, your addiction status, different things that could be very invasive and permanent and have financial implications to you as a person if it were to get out. And finally, there's also common threads of both the need within cybersecurity and public health to both prevent incidents from happening and then to manage ongoing insecurity, this need to respond and manage incidents as they happen. But finally, what I think is one of the most key similarities is public health data are not all federally held data. So when we think about CDC data, a lot of it is coming from a diversity of sources. It's coming from local and state governments. It's coming from private clinics. It's coming from nonprofits. It's coming from insurance companies. It's coming from researchers who are funded to conduct a survey. It's coming from places that may not be the CDC. And to quickly run through that, that's going to be, it could be collected directly by the CDC. It could also be other agencies that might report to you. It might be collected by states and voluntarily reported. It also might be privately held and also proprietary data. So that often comes into play with private hospitals or private insurance companies. So what are the takeaways from this? When looking at this whole system, how might this apply? For one thing, the system is organized to put both expert and collaborative decisions. So stakeholders have a say, people who are researchers and experts in their field, and also different communities. There's a diverse set of decisions that are made from the ground up. These decisions don't just come from the CDC down. There's also report minimization and decentralization. So there is this concept that we don't collect data, especially at a mass scale, if we don't need it and we don't have a specific purpose for why we collect it. We don't hoard data and then find a use later for it. But there is this critical discussion, again, of what would be vital, and these things change over time and have evolved over decades. We also, within public health, look at the earliest feasible de-identification. So often there's a awareness that there's a chilling effect when we want people to seek medical attention. We don't want them to be scared that there's an automatic reporting of their condition. So often identification, such as an individual and their HIV status, is kept at the location where they are served. It does not leave that location. It also never reaches the federal record. So another important thing is when you report data to the CDC or any federal agency, it becomes part of the federal record and then is subject to Freedom of Information Act and many other things that might make it vulnerable to disclose identity. There's also a bunch of limitations on non-public health uses. So they can assure people that it will only be used for this specific purpose, and they can also grant researchers who are working on contract that protects them from court order, which are additional protections that otherwise they wouldn't have but policy has been formed to protect people. So one key point that I think is very important when thinking about sensitive data that we would find in cybersecurity is open data does not necessarily mean naked data. We don't need to just put a data set out there to make it open and accessible. We have different access models for that. So we can make data open responsibly and let a diverse group of people have access to information without just dumping it somewhere and wishing for the best. And when we think about public health data, what's so important is the default and gold standard is that it will be made as open and accessible as possible. But if that is not true, if that's not possible based on the sensitivities in the data, then it moves down to different limited access regimes. So it might be you specifically request and there's a legal contract in place to how you will have the data, or you use a remote data access center. So the CDC works with public health data, they work with the Census Bureau and use some of the same infrastructure so that you may submit code, query the code, get your responses, and never touch sensitive data. There's also different mechanisms in place for if you do identify someone, what to do, and you're held responsible for that based on your agreement. And very little data is held within the CDC. Usually it's under review or it might have national security concerns. But again, the default is that it is made as open and accessible as possible. There are also non-governmental platforms. So CDC Wonder is a platform that has a lot of public health data, but there's also a platform called BioSense, which has a lot of bioterrorism-related data. It was funded around the time right after 9/11. That is held by a nonprofit, and it was funded by the government, but it's not held by the CDC. They have a role in governance, but it's mostly distributed among other people who want to contribute. So what are the highlights when we think about this for cybersecurity? It's important to clarify the connection to goals in advance of collecting data. We don't want to just willy-nilly collect it, and that's where the stakeholders and the researchers play a really key role in understanding what data do we need and what data should we collect. Also, there is a role for the federal government to coordinate activities and to help maybe do some seed funding, but it doesn't necessarily always have to reside at the federal government level. And again, that comes with a whole other host of issues when the federal government keeps data and it becomes part of the federal record. Also, most public health reporting is voluntary. And they had to work a long time so that people saw common value and benefit, and they saw the public good in giving data and taking the time and the administrative resources. And also, data should be made as open and accessible as possible by default. So in conclusion, we've got open challenges here. What are the incentives for people to share voluntarily? What might that look like within security? What might be the incentives not to share? And then how are we going to centralize and coordinate this? Again, we have proposals on the table from Congress right now. A lot of them lack specificity on how we're going to actually achieve this, and considering some of these alternative access models and alternative government structures. And then also finally, an awareness of public good benefit that would be derived from open data, not just information sharing. Thank you.
Thank you all. This was fascinating. I'll ask all of you that have questions to step up to the mic. And I guess there are questions? Good, yeah.
So everything's interesting. My name's Lawrence Heck. I'm an independent consultant. Cathy O'Neill, you made a lot of what I call a little bit of radical ideas. But my question for you is, how do you know when you should prize that information away from a company? Should you, what standards, for example, should you use antitrust standards where you have to, not that you have the data, but you've already proved that you are going against the public good? I mean, do you have to wait until something bad happens?
Cathy, I'm going to ask you to write it down, and we're going to take all questions because we don't want to leave any questions unasked. I can't say unanswered, but at least unasked.
Hi, so this is for Elaine. I like the idea of you submit code to a secure database which runs it and hands you the answer. But what is the process for validating that the code is safe, since that's essentially an unanswerable computer science problem? Or are you only looking at what is returned to decide whether what has been returned is safe?
Thank you.
I'm David Hayburn, a public space and placemaking strategist and designer. Questions primarily for Stephen, but Cathy and Elaine may have comments on it as well. About 60 years ago, public policy turned over our public space a lot to the automobile, which I'm sure you're very aware of. And it took us about 2 generations to learn the negative externalities that came from turning over so much of our public space to a promising new technology. And I'm just curious, at the onset of the open data transformation, what are the biggest lessons that we can learn from the automobile transformation and try to apply those same key learnings modified to an open data set or transformation going forward?
Hi, I'm Yannis Tsiligakis from the Henry George School of Social Science. My question has to do with how we would go about defining an information commons. You know, especially if information and data is produced, I mean, privately, however it's used to shape public policy, and also it's used by corporations to tap into economic value that again belong in the commons. So you see, we have to define what part of information belongs to the commons, and that will define accessibility, but also you know, what's the corollary impact on how we do our economics, because that's actually what really affects us all. So, thank you.
Good afternoon to the panel.
I'm just going to say, sorry, very quickly, we have 3 minutes remaining, so try to keep your questions brief, and
3.5
so we're going to
minutes.
have some answers too, hopefully.
Yeah, so first of all, my name is Yuri Paraschak. I pretend now to work after retiring at NYU in industry. And my observations are, having worked with a lot of data, is that the only need for data is to predict. If it doesn't predict, it's of no value. First of all, does the panel agree? Secondly, given the amount of effort that companies are putting into using these predictive models, ultimately for deciding what we do, because when we can figure out what you're going to do, then we can make money from it, where's the benefit to the average Joe anymore? Who's taking the advantage of this large data? Compare the benefits of people trying to do things in the government for individuals versus what companies are trying to do. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Daniel Kanop. I'm a master's student at the University of Maryland. And my question is for Stephen. Very interesting stuff about the traffic modeling data. And I was just wondering, with the linking of data sets and the introduction of self-driving cars, how could you incentivize policy for a desired behavior, such as reducing the amount of vehicles on the road using traffic modeling? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sue Gluck from Microsoft. My question was inspired by Elaine, but is actually for Stephen and Cathy. What do you see as the role of data minimization? Because as you're talking about using data, opening data, obtaining data, it seems like maybe minimization is not top of mind. So where do you see it playing a role?
Okay, we're gonna start with Cathy, then Steve, then.
Okay, I don't know what data minimization is, so yeah, you're right. It's not a priority for me. What is that? Is that compression? I don't even know what it means. So I'll let Stephen answer that. So in terms of whether we need to, how do we know when we need to like force private companies to show us their data? Again, like the great news is we actually have laws about this, you know? It's just that they're not keeping up with big data. So we have laws about whether your hiring is discriminatory. But now we have companies that small third-party data companies that provide algorithms for large, usually minimum wage workers to be hired and filtered through these algorithms. And they're not audited to see whether they comply with ADA, just as an example. So we already know that there's a law here. We don't know whether these big data models are complying with these laws. What I'm saying is we need a sort of a structure in place to force transparency on that so that we can actually audit it. Similarly with loans, we have laws about loans. What's going on with the peer-to-peer lending is that they're bypassing those laws because they're not directly extending credit. They're only providing a platform where they tag people with credit scores. That's just bypassing a law. The law should be modified. And I would expand, add a few more laws in places that haven't been thought of yet, but they're not like totally new. They're just extensions. Go ahead.
Okay. So, sorry, there were quite a few questions there, so I'll attempt to answer some of them. I also don't know what data minimization is, so not a priority in my mind. I wanted to speak to the idea of the information commons and trying to sort out what that means. And I think it means one thing if we're talking about information that's to be shared with everyone and information that's to be shared with people who are in a privileged research club. And I'm not qualified to speak about sharing with everyone, but I think from a research perspective, I think there's very few examples, or the examples where the research objective is directly at odds with the profit motive of a company are slim compared to the examples where the research objective is ancillary to the company's ability to make money. And that's not a principle. I don't think it's a law that says it's that way, but I think if we can identify those cases, that can give us some foundation for guidelines to data sharing. And then there was a question about data, what's safe to be disclosed, whether or not code is safe. And usually, my experience in working in the secure data environments is that it's the output that needs to be vetted, not the models or the code that goes into the data centers. So there's strict rules, at least in the Canadian Census Research Data Centers, around not just providing the results without disclosure checking, so they check for disclosure, but then they also enforce like mandatory random rounding, mandatory use of survey weights if they are available in the data set, mandatory use of bootstrapping and statistical techniques that allow you to further downplay the risk of disclosure or identification. So I know that was probably a question that you wanted to tackle, but I'll pass.
Sure. So a little bit more specificity. Something I did not mention that I should have explicitly called out was the fact that data are not free. So even though when we make data open and accessible, there is a large administrative burden to doing a lot of this review to ensure privacy and to think critically about what we're putting out there. And the RDCs are an excellent example, RDCs being research data centers. So it depends on the data set, from what I understand and the people I've talked to. They look at what is returned. They also will review the code that you're submitting. And again, it's dependent upon what your purpose is, how you plan to use it. And these processes are open to a diversity of people, not just academic researchers. And then there's this review of what was your central question. If you're publishing and it's something that we are particularly concerned about, again, HIV is the canonical example, but it's the canonical example for a reason. So there might be a stricter code, like you will submit your publication or your data set that you will be releasing first. And then they'll review that. There's also different contracts. There are situations where you don't need to use a research data center or a remote data center to access data. You might be given it, and then you're held by contract so they could have legal recourse if you do something wrong. And there is this obligation as a researcher or anyone who's using these privileged data sets that if you do re-identify someone, you are supposed to call a number and explain, and then there's a process for dealing with that. And then one quick word on information commons and deriving economic value. When we're thinking about cases like public health and cybersecurity and the public good we get from being more secure and being more healthy, as far as I think from an open data perspective, if we had startups or people who thought critically about the problem and made our world a better place, that's something that we don't care that we gave that away, that raised the bar for everyone, and that's kind of a benefit we all get.
I want to thank our panelists for this very insightful and interesting presentation. We are continuing straight to the next panel, so please have the panelists come up.